My friends, I want to begin today by acknowledging something directly, because I believe you deserve honesty rather than comfortable evasion on a subject this painful. If you clicked on this video, there is a real chance you already know exactly the feeling I am about to describe. The phone rings, you see your son or daughter's name on the screen, and before you have even answered, a small, unwelcome thought arrives uninvited. What do they need this time? Not, how wonderful, how are they? What do they need? And if that thought arrived with a flash of guilt for even having it, I want you to know, before we go any further, that this guilt is entirely misplaced. The thought is not a failure of your love. It is simply honest information your own heart has been quietly gathering for some time. I want to share with you today what I have learned, both through my own painful experience with one of my 3 children, and through many honest conversations with other parents navigating this exact same ache, an ache that carries a particular kind of loneliness precisely because it feels so difficult to speak about openly. We are taught, across an entire lifetime, that love for our children should be unconditional, and it is. But unconditional love does not mean unconditional blindness to a pattern that genuinely hurts, and it does not mean we are somehow bad parents for noticing, and being wounded by, a relationship that is quietly narrowed down to transaction rather than genuine connection. I lived this particular pain myself with my middle son for the better part of 6 years, years I spent largely in silence, telling no one, including my own wife, for far too long, because admitting this pattern out loud felt like admitting some private failure as a father, a failure I was not yet ready to name. I want to walk you through everything I eventually came to understand during those years and in the years since, because I believe this particular ache deserves considerably more honest, direct attention than most of us have ever permitted ourselves to give it. This is not a lesson about giving up on your child, and it is not a lesson about becoming bitter or withholding love. It is a lesson about seeing this particular pattern clearly, honestly, and compassionately, both toward your child and toward yourself, so that whatever comes next in the relationship can be built on truth rather than continued, quiet denial. The first thing I understood was that noticing this pattern honestly is not disloyalty, and I had spent years treating my own honest observation as a kind of betrayal I needed to suppress. I told myself, for a long time, that a good father simply did not keep score, that counting how many calls were requests versus how many were simply his son wanting to talk represented a pettiness I should be ashamed of. I eventually understood that honest observation is not the same as resentment. I could see the pattern clearly, name it honestly to myself, and still love my son completely. These two things had never actually been in conflict. I had simply been taught, somewhere along the way, that they were. The second thing I understood was that this pattern, however painful, rarely reflects a conscious, deliberate calculation on my son's part, and understanding this distinction changed how I carried the hurt considerably. I had spent years quietly assuming he understood exactly what he was doing, treating me as a resource to be tapped rather than a father to be known. Once I finally had an honest conversation with him, years into this pattern, I discovered something more complicated and, in its own way, more forgivable. He genuinely had not noticed the pattern himself, having simply absorbed, somewhere in his own busy adult life, an assumption that I would always be there, steady and available, requiring no particular tending because my presence in his life felt, to him, like a fixed and permanent fact rather than a relationship that, like any other, needed genuine attention to remain warm. The third thing I understood was that my own decades of unlimited, unconditional availability had likely taught him this particular pattern, not through any failing of character on his part, but through my own consistent behavior across his entire life. I recognized, looking back honestly, that I had never once, across his entire childhood and young adulthood, demonstrated that my own time and attention carried any genuine limit or required any genuine reciprocity. I had been endlessly available for every request, every crisis, every logistical need, without ever once modeling a relationship where two people simply enjoyed each other's company without any practical purpose attached. I had, in effect, trained him toward exactly the transactional pattern I later found so painful to receive. The fourth thing I understood was that grief was the honest, appropriate response to this pattern, and I had spent years bypassing this genuine grief in favor of either suppressed resentment or forced, cheerful denial. I finally allowed myself, with the help of a counselor, to genuinely grieve the closeness I had hoped for with my son and had not, in this particular season of our relationship, actually received. This grief, once permitted rather than suppressed, did not make me a weaker or more self-pitying father. It made me a more honest one, finally able to hold the genuine sadness of an imperfect relationship without either denying it or letting it curdle into a bitterness that would have served neither of us. The fifth thing I understood was that this particular pattern often intensifies, rather than improves, during specific seasons of an adult child's life, and recognizing these seasons helped me hold the pattern with somewhat more perspective. My son's calls became almost entirely transactional during the years he and his wife were raising very young children while both working demanding careers, a season of genuine, overwhelming business that, while it did not excuse the pattern entirely, did help me understand it as partly circumstantial rather than solely a reflection of how he genuinely felt about me. I noticed, as his own children grew somewhat more independent, that his calls gradually began including more genuine conversation again, unprompted by any particular need. The sixth thing I understood was that naming this pattern honestly to my son, rather than continuing to silently absorb it, was one of the hardest conversations of my entire life, and also one of the most important. I finally told him directly, calmly, and without accusation, that I had noticed our calls seemed to happen almost exclusively around specific needs, and that I missed simply talking with him without any particular purpose attached. This conversation was uncomfortable for us both, but it was also the first genuinely honest conversation about our relationship's actual shape that either of us had ever had, and it opened a door that 6 years of silent, private hurt had never once managed to open on its own. The seventh thing I understood was that his initial response to this conversation was defensive, and I needed to allow this defensiveness to exist without either escalating the conflict or immediately retreating from what I had genuinely needed to say. He responded, in that first conversation, with some genuine surprise and a degree of defensiveness, insisting he loved me deeply and had not intended any hurt. I did not argue with his intentions, which I genuinely believed were sincere. I simply, calmly, reiterated the pattern I had observed and the genuine hurt it had caused me, without requiring him to immediately agree or apologize before I would consider the conversation successful. The eighth thing I understood was that meaningful change, once this pattern was finally named honestly, arrives slowly and imperfectly rather than through any single dramatic transformation. I did not receive an immediate flood of purely social calls following our conversation. What I received, gradually, over the following year, was a slow, genuine shift, an occasional call that carried no particular request at all, a text simply checking in rather than asking for something, small signs that our conversation had genuinely registered even though the underlying pattern took considerable time to meaningfully soften. The ninth thing I understood was that I needed to genuinely, warmly receive these small, unprompted gestures when they finally arrived, rather than dismissing them or treating them with suspicion after years of disappointment. I recognized, honestly, that I had developed something of a defensive cynicism after years of purely transactional calls, and I needed to consciously guard against this cynicism poisoning the genuine, if still occasional, warmth that began slowly returning to our relationship. Meeting his small efforts with warmth and genuine appreciation, rather than a wounded, defensive coolness, made these small efforts considerably more likely to continue and deepen over time. The 10th thing I understood was that I needed to become somewhat more willing myself to initiate purely social contact, rather than continuing to wait passively for him to demonstrate this capacity first. I recognized that I had, in some ways, been waiting for him to prove his genuine care before I would risk reaching out purely socially myself, a passive stance that likely contributed to the very pattern I found so painful. I began calling him occasionally simply to talk, with no agenda, modeling directly the kind of connection I hoped we might eventually share more consistently, rather than continuing to wait indefinitely for him to demonstrate this first. The 11th thing I understood was that some version of this pattern is genuinely more common during certain broad seasons of modern adult life than I had initially realized, and this broader context, while not excusing the pain, did help me hold it with somewhat less personal wound. Speaking honestly with other parents navigating similar dynamics, I discovered how common this particular pattern genuinely is among adult children juggling demanding careers, young families, and considerable financial pressure, a broader cultural pattern that, while genuinely painful for the parents experiencing it, reflects something considerably larger than any single failure of love or character within any particular family. The 12th thing I understood was that I needed to distinguish honestly between a temporary, circumstantial business and a genuine, more permanent pattern of emotional distance, since these two situations required considerably different responses from me. I recognized that my son's particular pattern, examined honestly across many years, reflected genuine circumstantial business during a specific season rather than a fixed, permanent emotional distance, a distinction that shaped how patiently I was willing to wait for gradual improvement rather than pursuing a more urgent, dramatic intervention. The 13th thing I understood was that not every family's version of this pattern resolves as gently as mine eventually did, and I want to honor this honestly rather than promising an outcome that circumstances alone cannot guarantee. I have spoken with other parents whose adult children's pattern of transactional contact reflects something considerably more entrenched, sometimes connected to genuine, unresolved conflict, sometimes connected to a child's own unaddressed struggles that make genuine emotional availability difficult regardless of the parent's own efforts. I do not want to suggest that naming this pattern honestly guarantees the gentle resolution I was fortunate enough to eventually experience myself. The 14th thing I understood was that my own worth as a father and as a person could not be allowed to depend entirely on the current state of this one particular relationship, however painful its current shape happened to be. I recognized that I needed to actively cultivate other sources of genuine connection and meaning in my life, my marriage, my friendships, my own pursuits, rather than allowing my entire sense of well-being to rise and fall with whether a given week's calls from my son happened to include genuine conversation or only practical requests. The 15th thing I understood was that continuing to give generously, materially, and practically, without simultaneously addressing the emotional pattern honestly, would likely have simply reinforced the very dynamic causing me pain. I recognized that continuing unlimited practical generosity while privately nursing genuine hurt about the lack of emotional reciprocity was, in effect, teaching exactly the lesson I did not want taught, that unlimited practical support would continue flowing regardless of whether any genuine emotional connection accompanied it. Naming the pattern honestly, alongside continuing reasonable practical generosity, proved considerably more effective than either extreme of complete withdrawal or continued silent accommodation. The 16th thing I understood was that grandchildren, once they arrived, actually offered a genuine, unexpected bridge back toward warmer connection with my son, rather than simply becoming another source of purely logistical, transactional calls. While early grandchild-related calls did often carry a practical, transactional quality, requests for babysitting, logistical coordination, I found that my direct, warm relationship with my grandchildren themselves gradually created additional occasions for genuine connection with my son as well. Conversations about his children that were not requests for anything, simply genuine shared delight in watching them grow. The 17th thing I understood was that I needed to release any expectation that my son would ever fully understand or apologize for the years of pain this pattern had caused me, and that my own healing could not remain permanently contingent on receiving this understanding from him. I recognized that he might never fully grasp, from the inside, exactly how those years of primarily transactional contact had felt to me, and I needed to find genuine peace with this reality rather than continuing to wait indefinitely for a full acknowledgement that might, in truth, never arrive in the complete form I had once hoped for. The 18th thing I understood was that my own capacity to forgive this pattern, once genuinely addressed and at least partially improved, mattered considerably more to my own ongoing peace than any lingering resentment about the years when it had been at its worst. I chose, deliberately, to release the accumulated resentment of those 6 difficult years once genuine, if imperfect, improvement had become apparent, recognizing that continuing to carry this resentment forward would cost me considerably more than it would ever cost him, regardless of how genuinely justified the original hurt had been. The 19th thing I understood was that other family members, particularly my wife and my other 2 children, had their own honest perceptions of this same pattern that I had never fully invited into the conversation, and their perspectives ultimately helped me see the situation somewhat more completely. My wife, once I finally spoke honestly with her about what I had been carrying privately for years, revealed that she had noticed this same pattern considerably earlier than I had ever admitted it to myself, and had been quietly waiting for me to raise it directly rather than continuing to watch me absorb it in silence. This conversation with her, alongside the eventual conversation with my son, reminded me that pain carried in isolation often persists considerably longer than pain finally shared honestly with the people closest to us. The 20th thing I understood was that comparing my relationship with this particular son to my generally warmer relationships with my other 2 children required considerable care, since this comparison, if handled carelessly, risked introducing an additional layer of resentment rather than genuine, useful insight. I found it helpful to notice the contrast honestly, without allowing it to curdle into open favoritism or repeated, wounding comparison voiced aloud to any of my children. The contrast simply helped me recognize more clearly that the pattern with my middle son reflected something specific to our particular relationship's history, rather than some universal, unavoidable feature of adult parent-child relationships generally. The 21st thing I understood was that my own health, both physical and emotional, had been genuinely affected by years of carrying this particular hurt in silence, a connection I had not fully appreciated until a period of improved connection with my son coincided with a noticeable improvement in my own general well-being. I do not believe this improvement was coincidental. Carrying significant unaddressed relational pain for years, I came to understand, exacts a genuine toll on the body as well as the heart, a toll that began measurably lifting once the underlying pattern had finally been named honestly and had begun, gradually, to improve. The 22nd thing I understood was that I needed to hold space for the genuine possibility that some of my son's earlier transactional pattern reflected struggles of his own, financial pressure, marital strain, professional anxiety, that he had never fully disclosed to me, struggles that may have consumed considerably more of his emotional bandwidth than I had ever fully appreciated from the outside. Approaching this possibility with genuine curiosity rather than assumption, gently asking about his own life and struggles during our improved conversations, revealed several genuine pressures I had never previously known about, pressures that, once understood, added a layer of compassion to my perspective on those difficult years that judgment alone had never been able to provide. And the 23rd thing, the final lesson I want to leave you with today, is this: a relationship that has narrowed down to transaction can still widen back out again, but only once someone within it has the courage to name the narrowing honestly, rather than continuing to silently absorb it in the hope that time alone will somehow resolve what only honest conversation genuinely can. For 6 years, I believed that continued patience and continued silent generosity would eventually soften this pattern on its own. I finally understood that patience alone, without honest naming of the pattern itself, simply allowed the pattern to continue indefinitely, and that real change, when it finally came, arrived only once I found the courage to speak the painful truth directly rather than continuing to carry it alone. My friends, I want to speak directly, for a moment, to those of you watching this today whose situation has not yet softened the way mine eventually did, whose adult children's pattern of purely transactional contact has persisted despite your own honest efforts to address it. I want you to know that this is not evidence of your own failure as a parent, and it is not evidence that you are somehow unworthy of the deeper connection you genuinely deserve. Some relationships require more time to soften than others. Some require professional support beyond what an honest conversation alone can provide. And some, painfully, may not soften as fully as we hope within the years we have remaining. A genuine possibility I do not want to minimize simply because my own particular story eventually found its way toward warmer ground. I want to be honest, too, that even in relationships that do eventually improve, the improvement rarely erases the memory of the harder years entirely. I still, occasionally, feel a small echo of the old dread when my phone rings, even now, years into a considerably warmer relationship with my son. I have learned not to judge myself for this echo, understanding it simply as the natural residue of genuine pain once carried for a long time. Residue that softens further with each passing year of renewed warmth, even if it may never disappear completely. This, too, I have come to believe, is simply part of the honest texture of a real relationship healing over time, rather than any evidence that the healing itself was somehow incomplete or insufficient. I think often of a particular evening, roughly 2 years after that first, difficult conversation with my son, when he called me on an entirely ordinary Tuesday with no request whatsoever, simply wanting to tell me about a book he had just finished that reminded him of conversations we used to have when he was younger. I remember sitting with the phone against my ear, genuinely moved, recognizing this small, unprompted call for exactly what it was, evidence that the honest, difficult conversation I had once feared having had genuinely, gradually, begun to bear fruit. If you are watching this today and you recognize the particular ache I have described, the flash of dread before answering a call, the quiet counting of requests versus genuine conversation, I want you to know that this ache deserves to be honored rather than suppressed, and that naming it honestly, whether to your child directly, to a trusted friend, or simply to yourself in the privacy of your own reflection, is not a betrayal of your love. It is, in truth, one of the most honest expressions that love can take, a willingness to speak a painful truth in the genuine hope that the relationship might yet widen back out into something closer to what you have always hoped it could be. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you feel less alone in this particular ache, and offers you the courage to address it honestly rather than continuing to carry it silently. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Love your children fully, and also love yourselves enough to name what genuinely hurts. And trust that even a relationship narrowed by years of unspoken transaction can still, with honesty and patience, find its way back towards something considerably warmer. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay honest, stay hopeful, and remember, the conversation you are most afraid to have is very often the one most capable of finally changing everything. Thank you for watching.